Welcome to the July edition of QI Connect for 2019. So QI Connect provides an opportunity for colleagues across health and social care and beyond to learn from international leaders in the fields of improvement, innovation and integration. So welcome to QI Connect. I'm now going to pass you over to Jennifer, who will tell you a little bit more about the session and the technology. Good afternoon, Jennifer.
Good afternoon, Ruth, and hello to all of our QI Connectors joining us today. It's a lovely sunny day here in Glasgow for once. So I'm just going to do a couple of quick housekeeping slides just to get started on how to use WebEx. If you could please use the chat function that you see on the right-hand side of your screen to communicate, and I'll talk you through this in just a moment. We do want this to be a really interactive session, so please do feel free to provide any comments or questions throughout the chat. If you are having any technical difficulties, such as not being able to hear our presenters speak, or if you keep losing connection, then please message the event manager using the chat function or by pressing *0 on your telephone keypad. So these sessions are designed to be a fun, interactive learning experience, and we do encourage you to use the chat function to share any questions throughout the talk. And there will be, I should emphasise, there will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of the session as well. We'll also be sharing hyperlinks within the chat function to any resources mentioned to our speaker today, and we'll be circulating that afterwards as a resource library along with the slides and the link to our YouTube recording. So we did promise that today's session was going to be interactive, and this is where we get to the really interactive part of our introductory slides. So we're really delighted that we have so many organisations, and Ruth will talk you through just some of those in just a moment. And the countries joining us today for this QI Connect session. So we're really keen to find out where you're joining us from today. So if you could please select the annotation tool that you see circled in red on the screen there. And then click on the arrow icon, also circled in red, and then get ready and select the country that you're joining us from using your arrow. There sometimes can be a slight delay. Well, hello to Colleen joining us from Canada, and Katie, and this is where we see the UK disappear under all of those arrows. Sometimes there can be a little bit of a delay with some of our other international colleagues. So hello to Juliana Harris, and we've got a great representation from colleagues in Canada, which is brilliant. Hi Sandy. So I'm now going to, while that just catches up there, I'm now going to hand you back over to Ruth, who's going to just tell you a little bit more about QI Connect and take you through our exciting competition, so get ready for that.
Thank you, Jennifer, and I should have started by introducing myself as your guest chair today, Ruth Glassborough, Director of Improvement at Healthcare Improvement Scotland. So regular QI Connectors will know that we run a competition on each session. So the competition is you have to find the flag of the country I'm about to say, and the first person to click on it wins a very exciting prize. So if we get ready. Oh, I've got the ball, have I? Oh, okay.
Okay, if you just give us. This is the moment. We're so excited about this competition that there you go.
Okay, so the country whose flag you're looking for is Singapore.
Oh, almost. Oh, well done, Chris.
We've got a winner?
Yep.
We have. Chris is our winner. So congratulations, Chris. You win one of our world-renowned QI Connect mugs, and we'll be liaising with you to ensure we get that in the post to you. Okay, so as of July, we now have 1,082 organisations participating in QI Connect. Incredibly impressive. That includes every single one of our NHS boards in Scotland and 83 universities. And we're always delighted that QI Connect reaches our colleges and universities across the world. I'm told that this is up by 6 from the last QI Connect in June, so we keep adding individuals. Also, just to remind you that the rest of our back catalogue is available for you to watch and enjoy on our website. I can highly recommend them first thing in the morning, which is when I catch up. I also just want to highlight that we are delighted to have ISQA as a partner for QI Connect and also the Health Foundation. We are partnering with Q, an initiative that is being delivered by the Health Foundation and is also supported and co-funded by NHS Improvement. And then also I'd like to give a big shout out to our QI Connect team. It's been fascinating being the guest chair to see the amount of work that goes into this. So thank you to that team who enable this to run so smoothly. And today, I also want to introduce our guest questioner, Michael Canavan, who has recently started with us at HIS as our Quality Management System Portfolio Lead. Please do remember to tweet as you learn today, and that's the hashtag, as well as, of course, please entering any thoughts and questions in the chat box as we go through the presentation. So our guest speaker today, I'm delighted to be introducing, is Will Warburton, Director of Improvement at the Health Foundation. As a fellow introvert in a national leadership role, he is both an ongoing source of personal inspiration and support for me. His remit at the Health Foundation includes the Q community, which is focused on connecting people with improvement expertise across the UK, and also a collaborative with the Cambridge University to develop a research institute that is focused on producing practical learning about how to improve care. His previous roles include the Forum Director for the World Innovation Summit for Health and Operational Director at the Centre for Health Policy in the Institute of Global Health Innovation at Imperial College London. I also think he probably gets the award for the longest job titles there. He's also an honorary research fellow there. And prior to this, he worked in the NHS as Head of Operations for Women's and Children's Services at St Mary's Hospital and Queen Charlotte and Chelsea Hospital. He's also been a management consultant at KPMG, and he is also a Health Foundation Generation Q Fellow. On a more personal note, he is married to Abby, and he has 2 beautiful daughters, Millie 7 and Kitty 5, who I believe are going to make a guest appearance in his presentation today, so watch out for those. The report he has co-authored on spread that he's talking about today is, in my view, the best report ever written about spreading improvements in healthcare by a long shot. If you've not read it, we will put the link to it up in the chat box, and I am sure by the end of this presentation, it will be top of your reading pile. So I am delighted now to hand over to him to share with us more about this seminal work on the complexities of spreading healthcare innovations. Will, over to you.
Wow, thank you very much, Ruth. It really is a great privilege to be asked to present one of these QI webinars when you see who's done it before, and so I hope I can do that introduction justice. And thanks to everyone who's on for giving up time to join us today. It is, I don't want to be competitive, but I can see in the chat box various temperatures being exchanged. We are at 37 degrees, maybe 100 degrees Fahrenheit in London today. So I hope everyone is sitting comfortably. And Ruth's point, I suppose, as an introvert, this is probably the ideal medium for me to be presenting on, actually. But I'm very much looking forward to discussing this with you today. So, let's see if I get my. So we're going to be talking about the idea of spread, and we've called our work the Spread Challenge. What we're really dealing with here is something that's a common problem across many different areas in life at the moment, which is the replicability problem. And I think I might have been asked to pick up on this topic this month, as those of you in Scotland will probably know that this is July 2019 is the 23rd anniversary of the famous cloning of Dolly the sheep, who was made at the Roslin Institute in Edinburgh. And I sometimes wonder whether scientific feats like this have perhaps created an expectation that we should be able to replicate anything with ease quite exactly. I mean, if we can make an identical animal, how hard can it be to replicate a healthcare intervention? Well, the answer is, unfortunately, that it is very, very hard indeed. The brutal truth of the matter is that we're really not very good at spreading something that works in one place across health and social care. Great examples of care exist anywhere. We could probably all come up with our own examples. But firstly, they don't always spread. But what we're really concerned with is even when they do, they don't even achieve the same outcomes. And this is a kind of perpetual problem for health and care systems across the world. And it sort of leaves everyone frustrated. So you get politicians and policymakers berating their civil servants or leaders of healthcare systems who they see as not delivering. You get innovators who are struggling to get their ideas taken up. They kind of can get into language of seeing others as resistant or talking about not invented here syndrome. Meanwhile, healthcare professionals who might be taking up these ideas kind of groan under the weight of expectation of all these different possibilities and this idea that they should be able to implement ideas that might have taken years to develop elsewhere and significant investment without meaningful support or resources, all on top of extremely pressured day jobs. And then most importantly of all, patients and carers just want the best available care for themselves, for their families and their loved ones, and can't quite understand why we can't design a system that can achieve that for you, whether you're in Land's End or John O'Groats. So this is the challenge that I'm going to be discussing with you today, which is how can we really universalize the best? And to do that, I'm just going to start by asking for a bit of help from Roger Federer. Because I think Roger stands as a kind of poster child for high quality, high reliability. Swiss watch companies absolutely love him. It's not surprising. And this goal of achieving high quality, high reliable outcomes every time that you undertake an activity is a totally legitimate goal to aim for. The backbone of my argument is just that we're going to be that we need to pay much more attention to what it actually takes to deliver that. And what does it take to deliver that kind of consistent quality? If you just watch Roger, maybe it's just a freak of nature, maybe he's a natural talent, and sure, there's probably a bit of that. But behind all of that lies thousands upon thousands of hours of practice. A whole system sits behind an individual like that supports that kind of excellence. Coaches, physios, nutritionists, state-of-the-art preparation and recovery planning and kit, friends and family support, an upbringing that allowed for him to take the time out for private coaching for that kind of national funding that supported him through school. And when you combine all of that and many other things with Roger's genetic code and his preternatural determination and temperament, sure, you get 102 singles titles and 20 majors. But it's not just the natural talent, it's everything that sits around it. And despite what some might claim, like this rather remarkable offer from the reliable friend, the internet, you can't actually just go online, download a handy guide, and then start getting the same results as Roger Federer. If you've got different genes, different parents, different kit, don't have that history, training, physio support, the outcome's not going to look the same every time. And so, in short, what this probably means for my girls who Ruth trailed is that they're maybe going to have to find a way of making a living another way, if this is the extent of the kit that their dad can provide for them to do their tennis training. But I use that just as a light-hearted way of introducing a key idea, that achieving an outcome is never just about a training manual or an intervention, but all the things that go around it, what people often refer to as the context. So we'll come back to that later. But now, although I know where many of you are coming from, I don't know much about necessarily the angles that you might be coming at this from. So this is just using the same techniques that Ruth asked you to use when saying where you're coming from or guessing which the Singaporean flag was. Would you say that you identify, and could you just click on any one of these? If you think about your last involvement in spreading an innovation, do you think I primarily identify as someone trying to spread an innovation, an adopter, patient perspective, just interested from how you get these things going nationally, or just a sort of general interest in quality improvement? I think I've only allowed one thing, so of course I recognise you could be more than one of these things. Well, that's great. So we've got a very nice spread, although few, I suppose, and understandably, we haven't necessarily got people coming from the patient perspective so much on the call, but very helpful in terms of helping me tailor some of the comments that I'm going to make here. So as Ruth mentioned, I just want to sort of give a reference point for where a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is coming from. This is the Spread Challenge, the report that Ruth mentioned. And over the past 10 years, for any of you who don't know the Health Foundation, we're a charity, and we fund and support healthcare improvement as one of our main activities. And over the last decade or so, we've funded, supported 5 major spread-related programs, together about 44 projects, and around 26 of those were aiming to take a defined intervention from one site and say, how can we replicate that in another? Those were the focus for this research, and we drew on the evaluations for those projects, interviews with the leads, with people who had been taking them up, and we did survey work as well, and wrote that all up in this publication, which is available to download from our website, or as Ruth says, she'll share the link with you. So, important starting point for the argument is that we have to start by understanding the complexity of the intervention that we're trying to spread. So, defining what's a simple intervention and what's complex certainly isn't a hard science, but literature on complexity does suggest some kind of guidelines. So at one end of the spectrum, the more simple end, you can think about how many components does an intervention have. So something like, we haven't got it on this chart, but something like Hello, My Name Is, which has been a fantastic intervention. For those who are not within the UK, I don't know how far it's gone internationally, just encouraging people to introduce themselves in the healthcare setting by wearing badges that say, hello, my name is, and opening conversations in that way. It doesn't have many components as an intervention. It's very easily repeatable. And it's the sort of, so that would steer us towards that simple end of the spectrum. Another thing, dynamic in terms of how simple or complex is how context embedded something is. So to what extent that intervention is shaped by all of the things that go around it, the underlying systems, culture, circumstances. And a third dynamic is how intricate the kind of pathways are within a particular intervention. So for example there, if you're looking at a multi-component care bundle, which we've got towards the more complex end, then you could take something like the Sepsis 6 care bundle, which as many of you will know is using 6 key tasks required to treat a patient with sepsis in a timely manner, including antibiotic and oxygen administration. Now what's really interesting is when you actually unpick the Sepsis 6 and you look at all the individual tasks and all the conversations and all the negotiation and agreement that has to go on, you could probably identify more than around 48 steps was the researcher's estimate that are required to implement that bundle and they will be dependent on each other. So it's a much more towards that complex end of the territory. And I think this is a really important distinction to make, because people will often take and apply the sort of methods for spread that might be relevant for a simple intervention and try and apply them at the complex end. And if you have a simple intervention, you get to talk about hello, my name is, it could be, arguably what matters to you is not simple, but it's a small number of components. These sort of things, people see them spreading through social media, they see them spreading through relatively simple kind of mechanisms that just tell you, okay, this is the idea, this is what you need to do around that. That might be very appropriate for simple mechanisms. Replacement drugs or devices, it might be very simple and right that you use bodies like in the UK, NICE and guidelines to try and influence and spread those. Those kind of mechanisms aren't going to be sufficient when you come to trying to spread more complex care interventions. And as we enter an age of multimorbidity, as we enter an age of integration of health and social care, more and more of the interventions that we need to make are going to be at this more complex end. So we're going to focus more in this conversation on the complex end. Obviously, there's a huge literature relating to diffusion of innovation that I think applies very well at the simple end, but I think this is much less discovered territory in terms of what it takes to spread complex interventions. And I'm going to use a case example as we go through. And using a example from one of the programs that we funded and studied, which was the Share HD program, which was a quality improvement collaborative aiming to scale up shared hemodialysis care for hospital-based hemodialysis patients. So I think we've got a short video that just introduces this program, which I'm going to ask the team to play for me now.
It feels really good. I actually enjoy doing it. I like being in control of my own treatment.
Getting our lives back, being able to please ourselves when we come in. It is scary to start with, but the benefits was unbelievable. For people with advanced chronic kidney disease, there comes a point when many people need to have dialysis. And dialysis is a complex treatment which takes over the role of the kidney. So shared hemodialysis care, where people on centre-based dialysis and centres such as this are given the opportunity to learn parts of their care. The goal was to see whether people could be given the opportunity to learn more about their own treatment and what that would bring, what that would lead to.
I think knowing about the machine, what it does, it empowers you as well. It gives you some self-esteem that you're involved in your own treatment.
Lovely, thank you, team. And I'm going to be using Share HD as an example as I take you through now 3 key lessons that I want to draw out from the research. So I'll return to that later, but I thought it was useful just to introduce the idea now. You can see there some of the things I'm talking about. If you think about that as a complex intervention, clearly the fact that it's a patient engaged, co-produced intervention brings in elements of complexity that we'll explore a bit more in more detail in a moment. But the first of my 3 kind of key messages that we're going to work through is about understanding the intervention in context. And clearly, this is where that Federer example speaks to this kind of agenda, but this applies equally in terms of healthcare. And I see within the chat box also comments around soft skills. And this is absolutely spot on in terms of where we're going to go. So we've spoken a little about how complexity of modern interventions raises challenges for effective replication. How can you actually copy something if you can't describe it thoroughly, and if you don't have everything around it that made it work in the first place? And a fantastic example of this is PROMPT, which stands for Practical Obstetric Multi-Professional Training, which was developed at Southmead Hospital in Bristol, which is one of the safest places in the country to have a baby, really impressive evidence base associating prompt with significant improvements in care outcomes. Now, the fascinating thing around prompt is a one-day annual training course. It uses simulation models to help maternity teams develop technical and behavioral skills to manage obstetric emergencies. And this has been spread widely. Now, it hasn't achieved the same results in all settings, even when the training seems to have been implemented with fidelity, which suggests that there's something more that makes Southmead safe than a training course, however well described that is in the technical manual that's gone to people. And there's a lovely paper by Eliza Liberetti, Mary Dixon Woods and colleagues that came out recently called How to Be a Very Safe Maternity Unit that would be well worth a few minutes of your time. It shows how the training prompt is a vital component of what makes Southmead safe and what's achieving these fantastic outcomes. But it's by no means the whole story. It's a much wider set of factors that sits around it, including the technical proficiency of staff that the training, of course, contributes to, collegial behaviours that the training also contributes to, but is not the only way that that's achieved, and then other things that don't really relate to the training, like the fact they monitor and sense make from multiple sources of data, and they have regular practices and day-to-day behaviours that create a safe environment. So it's really important that when we're thinking about how we describe interventions, that we describe not just the technical aspects of training or the technical aspects of something, but actually everything else that sits around it, by which would include the capabilities that people need, what methods people might need to apply, and the sort of cultural or softer aspects that make an intervention work. And this can sound fairly intimidating or abstract, but it's actually intensely practical. I mean, one example I really like in prompt was it's just actually they have a multidisciplinary staff room, which is a space for staff to gather. It's used flexibly by doctors, midwives, other staff, kind of blurred boundaries between a social space and workspace. And it's where a lot of relationships get built and trust is developed and kind of authentic desire to help each other kind of informed by the relationships that are built in that room. Now, the result is when people know each other well, then they're more aware of each other's strengths, weaknesses, their mood that day, what's going on for them, their ability to cope. They are able to then make decisions, take actions accordingly. If you didn't have any of that and you just had a one-day training course, then it sort of kind of becomes obvious, right, that you wouldn't get the same sort of healthy relationships between doctors, midwives, healthcare assistants in an emergency situation. They might have done the drill, but actually the trust and the ability to negotiate roles and so on is built on a very strong social fabric. A fun aside from that is that I've just heard, I don't know if this is true, it may well be apocryphal, but I don't mind spreading it because it sounds so good, that this article that Mary and team wrote actually helped save that staff room at Southmead. So if any of you are ever faced with a scenario where someone's threatening to take your multidisciplinary staff room away, then feel free to get in touch with me for an evidence-based kind of riposte to anyone suggesting that rooms for people to gather in and form relationships aren't important. Now, all of this has considerable implications for how we describe and codify interventions when we come to spread something. So in the spread challenge, we talk about two potential approaches, which I hope is a helpful kind of clarifying concept. So clearly, there's a spectrum here too. And we talk about tightening or loosening impulses. So by tightening, we mean, let's say you have an intervention that you think you can describe. You try and explain to others how you do that by having more comprehensive, more fine-grained specification of it. You kind of specify perhaps the method that should be used, or you set out some of these social kind of sides of it in addition to the technical components. And you can see that as and we call that kind of a tightening approach. And it's often a kind of default mode of how we try and do spread is provide more information. I'm not saying it's the wrong thing to do. I think it's very important that we set out those, but it's one approach. Now, an alternative kind of view is that you loosen the description of the intervention by focusing less on detail A, B, C, D, E, and more on what's this actually trying to achieve? What's the theory of change behind it? And can we be faithful to the theory of change rather than to the exact steps? Or what's the philosophy behind this? And can we work towards the principles and goals of this intervention, but allow people locally to work towards their own way of fulfilling those? And the shared hemodialysis care that I'll talk to will be a good example of that kind of approach. A really extreme kind of version of this, loosening approach, is taking a capability building approach to how we do spread. So this is a world away from sending out a missive from a national body to say everyone must implement X. This is an approach that says actually you build the ability to discover your way to the solution locally. And we're funding a program that some of you may have come across called the Flow Coaching Academy in the UK, which was built out of some great work that took place in Sheffield and Warwick that was all about improving flow across pathways. And they came up with some really impactful interventions, including, for example, something called discharge to assess, which is a way of supporting people to get home and have their social care assessment in their own home rather than needing to wait in hospital to be seen for that. Now, we didn't want to spread the intervention, so what we've encouraged the team to do is spread the way that intervention was discovered. So developed a curriculum in quality improvement and team coaching and set that alongside the method, which they call the big room method, of a regular standardized meeting that brings together staff and patients who are involved in a pathway alongside the data and others that can help support change in that pathway. And they meet regularly to iteratively develop ideas, test new ways of doing things, monitor progress, discuss issues and work out what they might do in terms of action, a kind of classic PDSA type cycle. But it's an interesting approach to trying to spread the kind of the means and the way of discovering your way to good ideas rather than spreading the thing itself. We've got an evaluation of that, which we hope to be able to say more about in the near future. It'll be very interesting to see how that kind of mechanism differs from the classic spreading of the intervention. But the bottom line here is that different contexts may require adaptation. An intervention success is going to be influenced by that organizational context. It's going to be influenced by the social and relational elements. So it's maybe necessary to adapt it to try and make it work in a different context. But this in turn means understanding that intervention so that you can describe which components are core to making that work and what might change. And we'll say a bit more about that in the second part. But I was just really interested to find out whether this reflects experience of the group on here, particularly given that we've learned we do have a number of innovators or people who've identified as adopters and a number of people running national programs too. So if you have a look at these couple of questions, and if you think again back to that example that you're using of an innovation that you've been working on, then can you say, have you made adaptations to an intervention during the process of implementing it in your own setting? And if so, would you say these adaptations were necessary in order to implement the intervention successfully in your own setting? And can we open a quick poll? I think it's just a yes, no, straightforward answer that should be appearing in your chat box. And so if you can select one of each of those and then press submit, then I think we will get an automatic answer to that question popping up. Right. Okay. The poll has ended. Can we see the results? So those we've answered, we've got people saying vast majority in terms of yes and yes. So people have made adaptations and say those adaptations would work. And that tallies pretty much exactly with the findings from the people we interviewed who have been doing Health Foundation programs. So 81% have made adaptations to the intervention. And of those, nearly all said those adaptations were necessary. And again, sometimes this might seem obvious, but actually this insight isn't reflected in the way that we design and deliver programs much of the time. So we'll come to that in the conclusions of how we can do more to actually reflect these insights. Now, what does this mean relating to our case study? Well, shared hemodialysis, if you think about that, obviously heavily context dependent because it's fundamentally co-produced with patients. So the health literacy, the confidence, knowledge, skills of patients make a tremendous difference to what that intervention looks like in different contexts. The nature of facilities and teams will vary very much by location. And the starting point is that there's very significant variation in the proportion of patients who are having dialysis at home. Patients, obviously, who are having dialysis at home have gone through significant process in terms of that learning. So these sort of contextual starting points are very different. So that's my first kind of key message, is that we need to understand the intervention in context and the interplay between intervention and context. The second is that we can really learn from the process of spread. Effectively, what we argue is that adopters need to think differently about the role of adopters through the process of spread. It's certainly not a simple linear progression from innovation to adoption, but actually we can learn from each wave of adopters about what really makes an intervention work and how to spread it effectively. So innovators often can't see their own context, right? It's very hard to know, say the fish is the last to notice the sea, what's actually around you that's making something you do effective. Evaluation can help, peers can help, but actually when you're introducing an intervention into another site, you get an amazingly fresh insight into what it is and what isn't significant for making it work. And that then allows the innovator to revise the description of the intervention, and in some cases to even revise the intervention itself. So this first stage of spread is really about testing and learning, and often a stage that's neglected when we're trying to spread things nationally. Typically we may go from a local, or be asked to go from a local success to national spread without having been through this phase. And this is a learning process in which the intervention might undergo substantial reconceptualization and refinement, and it often looks quite different from attempts to spread an intervention at later stages of maturity, a complex intervention, when you might then be able to codify it with greater confidence, and fidelity can become a bit more clear-cut. As I say, that's really useful in terms of helping us understand what's core versus what's peripheral. What are the things that you can change and that are susceptible to adaptation, and what are the things that absolutely have to stay the same to make the intervention work? And we argue that actually we should recognize this stage, kind of what we call the testing and revision stage, as a formal part of the innovation cycle, distinct from attempts to spread the intervention, to sort of develop the intervention in the first place and then to spread it at a later stage of maturity. And I think this is a really interesting one where you are coming under pressure to spread something nationally by yesterday, that actually we stop and we say, well, do we really know what makes this thing work? And in order to be able to do that, what we really need to do is try it in 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 places and observe what works in what context. And then that gives us the confidence to be able to move on to the later stages of dissemination and mature scaling. So this may be a helpful slide to keep in the back pocket. what we're really arguing is that we need to therefore rethink the kind of pipeline model of spread. And it's interesting that people will often use the language of pipelines. People will often talk about diffusion of innovation as if gas is sort of passing through a pipeline in an unchanging way, whereas actually it's entering really different kind of settings, and it's just the wrong metaphor for the problem that we're facing. And academics like Penelope Hoare have argued that that terminology needs to be challenged, and I think we agree based on what's come through our learning. And here we suggest a different idea of actually, rather than thinking of people as adopters or early adopters, that we try and create a language of co-innovators. So recognizing that the people who are taking up an idea in the early stages are really making a really important intellectual and practical contribution to what makes an intervention effective in the first place. And this is quite a mindset shift from the idea that there is an all-powerful, all-knowing inventor over here that defines what makes something work, and then everyone else is an adopter or recipient or a laggard or whatever they might be. And that something can just be disseminated in that way. It actually says that early adopters are generating knowledge that really informs the intervention. And again, to move from the abstract to something more practical, for shared HD, then the experience of trying to spread the intervention led them to really reflect on what shared hemodialysis care actually consists of and what the essence of that intervention was. So when we funded the team originally, before they got this spread award, then they had a very strong focus that there was a target that patients should be able to do a specific number. They broke down 14 hemodialysis tasks that they thought were needed to really own your own care. They had a very specific target around, I think, at least 7 of these that people should be able to do. They might have revised that down from experience to 5. But through testing it in multiple sites, the team discovered that enhancing patient experience wasn't necessarily achieved by patients carrying out a certain number of tasks, but it was rather about them saying, what would you like to learn? And that was what put patients in control of their care and supported improvements in experience and confidence. And all of this has meant that the intervention looks very different from site to site in shared HD. And remember, this is one at the loosening end of the spectrum. But very occasionally, they've had concerns about the way that people have taken an idea locally, such as one site stipulated that shared hemodialysis could only be done on a single shared care bed, and they felt that wasn't actually in line with the cultural ethos of trying to empower patients throughout the unit. So they have made interventions to say, we're not going to give you flexibility on that. But as a general rule, local customization has been viewed really positively by the program leaders, both as a kind of central aspect of making it work in new settings, but also as an important source of learning as the intervention spreads. So this is Sonia Lee, who's the program lead. Thought everyone was doing similar things. Turns out everyone's got their own interpretation, but by listening to adopters, listening to what they got, helps us understand what the key ingredients actually are. So those adopters are playing a role in actually developing and improving the intervention and helping them recognize that what actually makes this effective. Now, it's not to say, by the way, that loosening is always right. If you go back to that prompt example, you aren't going to get a safety on maternity unit if you just say it's all about relationships, which is one of the sort of, you get people going to that extreme. Clearly, having a safe maternity unit is also about technical training. It's also about accountability. It's also about everything. So it's not saying you can just let everything go, but it is saying recognize that as something is implemented in different contexts, there's going to be really valuable learning that can help you as an innovator or as a program director, national lead for a program spread, to understand what's making it work and what makes it effective. And my third and final key message, which follows on from the logic of the first two, is support adopters, support and enable adopters. So we need to really value adopters, see them as co-innovators, recognise adoption as a creative process in its own right, worthy of all the praise, reward and recognition that's given to innovators. And adopters need support and methods to take up ideas. I'm hoping that that last one will be an easy sell to a quality improvement audience, but adoption really requires time, resources, capability, organisational capacity. And it might sound obvious, but it's rarely taken account of. You know, whenever you hear someone talk about rollout, your ears should prick up on our theme of language. Rollout is a kind of assumption that there's an implicit assumption there that the hard work's been done, and now we just need to take this carpet or whatever it is and just roll it out across flat terrain and then job done. Whereas actually the hard work of change exists just as much in the adoption and the take-up of ideas as it does in the discovery of the new. So we want much more emphasis on supporting adoption. Programs need to include support for implementation, and that could involve anything from funding to help an adopter site create necessary capacity. That might be project management, administrative, backfill staff positions, or support the upfront costs of adoption for any double running costs. It could also include embedded support in particular skills like analytics or evaluation, or mechanisms that support peer learning between sites. But there needs to be a whole suite of things that support adopters to actually take up ideas that, again, are often missing and assumed that people can just sort of do this. And our adopter survey kind of backed this up. It said we need to provide more opportunities. This was asking adopters, in hindsight, what changes would have helped them to adopt an intervention. And the things they really wanted were this peer learning opportunity, sharing learning from others, how they're getting over particular challenges, more support for readiness, unsurprisingly more time, and training and support. So all of this, and then if you look down the bottom, the things they were less worried about was whether they needed more detailed description and so on. So the core kind of message to policymakers here is that if you want to get a fully flourishing garden, then don't just focus on the seed, we need to cultivate the soil. So investing in people and organizations' improvement capability means those organizations have the ability to take up ideas and have ways of iteratively introducing them into their ways of working locally that can improve and develop and make those ideas work. So that's the main three messages there. And to finish, I'm just going to go back to a photo of Roger winning Wimbledon, not this year, but it's that whole thing of just imagining, I showed you a video of his final game in the final, made you watch it and said, okay, now go and win Wimbledon. Now, it's not so straightforward. You could probably buy the racket. You might be able to wear the kit. If you've got the gift of the gab, you might blag your way onto centre court. I don't know. But it's not going to win you Wimbledon. You're going to need all of that support, that coaching, nutritionist, the physiotherapy, the funding, the facilities. And what that looks for me is going to be very different to what it looks like for any of you. Not to mention the basic differences in hand-eye coordination in the first place. But we'd all do it very differently. So we need to really get behind what makes things happen rather than just focus on the end result. It's not enough to will the ends without prescribing the means. And that means we need to stop not taking account of context or using simplistic models of rollout and jumping from pilot to full rollout, or assuming that when something's been done in one place, others can follow fast and for free. Instead, we need to start understanding the things that we're trying to spread really well and then choosing the right method to do so. We need to learn from the early stages of spread, including from adopters' experiences and co-innovators, and then giving adopters the support they need to do that creative work of adoption. And so if we can do all of that, then we can all be spread champions and get some joy out of it as we do so. So thank you very much for listening, and in the time we have, look forward to discussing any aspect of that with you.
Great, thank you very much, Will. And we are now going to move straight over to our guest questioner today, Michael, who's going to start with our first question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Will, for a really comprehensive presentation. I know that I'll be reflecting on a lot of what's been saying for a while and using some of your insights, not least because I've got a paper to write about spread for our own executive team. So my question is related to the central message of the report, and you've covered a lot of it, but the paper highlights the key role of adopters and the requirement for resource, time and space to empower teams to translate an intervention to their own setting. And that really resonates with me, having been involved in quality improvement, and I'm sure others will agree. The question is, how might we convince those who push for rapid spread of an idea across a whole system? As you discussed that whole sort of rollout, or notion of rollout, how can we convince those who push for that approach?
Michael, it's a great question, and the joy of doing work from a research kind of organisation and funding organisation like the Foundation is that I can sort of put forward all the provocation, but recognise that the reality for most people is that it's very hard to actually push back on that sort of expectation. I'm not so practicing that. It's a great art of the civil servant or a thing to be able to negotiate this. But let's assume that you have someone who's prepared to listen, which I know is a starting point. Let's say we do. I think you can say, look, the evidence is that most interventions don't achieve the same outcomes in different places. So if your goal is to make that difference for your population, for your constituents, then it's really worth paying attention to some of that evidence if you don't want to miss the mark and you don't want to waste those kinds of resources. And I think obviously, the way that I've expressed things is quite a lot of conceptual ideas in there. Maybe the analogies can help, so whether on that message around thinking about context, whether that kind of tennis analogy works, thinking about everything that supports something rather than just focusing on the end thing. On testing and revision, most people would accept. It's interesting, and if you look into, I know it's not exact, there are differences, but if you look at pharmaceuticals or if you look at other kind of types of innovation, then there's no way that a politician or a policymaker would let a drug company go from animal testing to whole population kind of implementation without a really thorough process of phase 2, 3, and 4 clinical trials. And yet in service innovation and complex service innovation, we often try and expect people to make that leap. Someone will come back from a visit and say, let's just do that everywhere. But, maybe using that kind of analogy can say, well, we should really learn about how this works in a couple of different places before going nationwide, because there's something really special about the place you saw that's made that possible. And then thirdly, that kind of one I've used with a senior policymaker in this country who I knew had a biblical bent was that kind of don't throw your seeds on stony ground. So the idea of investing in adopters, investing in improvement capability, cultivating the soil, it's trying to find some sort of analogy or metaphor that can help people understand why it's not necessarily the right thing to do just to try and roll everything out at pace. And in the end, you're trying to help them achieve the same goal of getting this benefit to everybody. That all assumes a very rational universe, which may not be the one that we live in. I don't know if you just noticed a recent activity here in the UK suggests that the political universe is far from a rational one. But that's a personal view, not a Health Foundation view I hesitate to add. But at least putting those forward, those kinds of arguments, can help people to see that you're on their side, but we need to take time to do this well and to make it effective.
Great, thank you for that. We've got a number of questions that have been coming in through the chat box. So the first one I'm going to highlight is from Kathy Welch, who is a GP from the Aaron Medical Group. And she says, you've talked a lot about the mechanisms of implementing change and about adopters nationally and locally. What cultural factors, organisational and local workplace culture, are required, beneficial and obstructive to successful innovation and implementation of change and improvement? It's a long question, but it's a great question, and Will, you'll see it there in the chat box towards the end.
It is a great question. Thank you, Kathy. I mean, we talk a little bit about this in the paper. I think that some of the the overall capability within an organization in terms of management and leadership is really strongly associated with uptake of best practice. If you look at business literature and industrial literature, there hasn't been as much research as there perhaps could be in healthcare on making this association between good management and leadership and uptake of innovation. But particularly important here is that role of management and leadership in influencing organizational culture. So a learning culture, which those of you interested in patient safety and so on will be very familiar with this kind of work, where staff feel safe and able to question existing practice. That can be a key enabler of innovation and improvement. If you've got a blame-focused culture, which is highly risk-averse, then people aren't going to take the risk of taking up a new idea. You've obviously got the kind of improvement skills which I think lend themselves very well to this agenda in terms of identifying problems, testing new ideas, making improvements, and so on. So there's a whole suite of kind of cultural factors and skills that are required to really support successful uptake and change. And if I could have a magic wand, I'd actually try and bring the innovation and improvement worlds much, much more close together because they tend to organize separately, with innovation often being driven obviously by industrial strategy type approaches and improvement being much more owned locally. But actually, I think they have a lot in common and a lot to learn from each other, and that's one of the goals of this work.
Thank you there, Will. Probably we're going to run over a little bit. I'm just going to take two more questions. The first is from Chris Weatherburn, who's a GP. The question here is, it is my understanding that ethics approval would deem a study that is intended to be generalizable as research as opposed to quality improvement. Do you consider this a barrier? You know, Chris, I'm actually going to pass on that one because I don't feel like I'm an expert. I think this is a very live debate, but I wouldn't want to impose a view, and I don't feel expert in that territory. I do think that there's a very, very live debate to be had about when service improvement requires an ethics approval, and I think that's particularly relevant when it comes to some of these more complex kind of changes. But as that's not a deep area of expertise for me, I will leave that for others. Great. Thank you, Will, and I love the confidence that you have to pass on that. The next one is from Anna Bayliss, who is the director at the Good Research Place, and the question here is, at what point are adopters expected to query and collate evidence regarding whether that innovation was needed in the first instance or was the right solution to the right problem? A lot behind that question.
Oh, that's a lovely question. It's a good job I've got a whole minute to answer it.
2 minutes, Will.
I mean, I think this is a really interesting tension. I mean, this is absolutely why I'm arguing that adoption is a creative process and needs to be recognized as one when you come into a different context. And that includes asking that question of, is this the right intervention to solve the problem that we have locally? And if not, then it might be a pushback at that point to say, this may not be for us because we're going to, but it doesn't have to be because our issue is X, Y, Z, and we're going to tackle it with A, B, C. Or it might be, more often than not, an adaptation that is then, this is where you have adopters playing that co-innovator that says, we need to make that adaptation in order to make this relevant to our problem. I'm not of the school that says that every solution has to be generated locally. Depending on the problem, it can make a lot of sense, and it's not a good use of healthcare resources for everywhere to try and invent its own solution to the problem. But I am a very big fan of the idea that you need to have identified your local need and then understand how this innovation is going to support that. And the sorts of methods, quality improvement methods, for example, are very good option that allow for that iterative assessment of whether this is the right thing for us or not. I think are very useful in addressing that.
Thank you, Will. You've given us so much to think about in this presentation today, and I'm sure the Health Foundation will see the downloads of that report suddenly spike after this presentation as well. It really is a fantastic report, and there's more in it than was covered by Will, and there was loads covered today, so thank you so much. Just to remind everyone that our speaker for next month is Dan Heath, who is an author, I think that many of you will have heard of before. So we're very much looking forward to Dan. We also have a range of other exciting presenters lined up for the rest of this year, as you can see on your screen. So please do keep in contact with us, and we look forward to you joining us in August and through to September and whatever dates we get for the next two speakers after that. And then finally, please do keep following us on Twitter. Stay connected to us at HisQI Connect, and you will also get all the latest information through that, confirming dates and future speakers as well. So thank you to everyone today for your participation, and please do enjoy, for those of you who are in the UK, the gorgeous weather, and maybe even have your dinner outside tonight. That would be a rare treat for us in Scotland. Thank you all. Bye-bye.